The cafeteria of Station X-17 was always crowded at this hour. Alien voices mixed together in a cacophony of sounds, some musical, some harsh, some almost like mechanical grinding. Bright colors swirled as various species moved around, carrying trays of food, exchanging jokes, or discussing the latest shipments and missions. Leora sat in the corner, her tray untouched, staring at the small window that looked out into the endless blackness of space. She was pale blue, with faint lines across her skin that glowed faintly whenever she felt strong emotion. Her eyes were large, reflective, and had a depth that made others uneasy. They whispered about her behind her back, about how quiet she was, about her strange talents with sensors and alien technology. Some said she was gifted, others said she was odd. Whatever the reason, no one ever chose to sit near her. Every day she ate alone. She tried not to mind, though her chest sometimes tightened with loneliness. She would glance around, hoping someone might join her, someone who didn't look at her with fear or judgment, but no one ever did. She had learned long ago that staring rarely changed anything. Across the cafeteria, humans were uncommon. Most humans were technicians, engineers, or specialists assigned to certain tasks. Ethan was one of them. A quiet man with soft brown hair and steady eyes, he moved with a calm, purposeful energy. He didn't rush, didn't raise his voice, and rarely participated in the loud jokes or banter of others. He preferred to observe first, understand, then act. On this day, Ethan was carrying a small tray of food. He had noticed Leora sitting alone on his previous trips to the cafeteria. He had watched the same pattern repeat itself. The tray untouched, the hopeful glances, the sigh as yet another group of aliens passed by, laughing and chatting, none of them stopping. Today, he decided to do something he hadn't done before. He walked across the room and, without a word, sat down beside her. His tray was small, but neatly arranged, with a few protein cubes, some fruit, and a small drink. He didn't look at her, didn't comment on her quietness. He simply sat and began eating. Leora stiffened, unsure what to do. She wasn't used to someone sitting beside her voluntarily, let alone a human, who were often loud or clumsy in their attempts to be friendly. She expected questions, comments, teasing, something to disrupt her fragile calm. But Ethan simply sat, quiet and steady. She dared to glance at him. He smiled faintly, just enough to acknowledge her presence without intruding. That tiny smile was enough to make her chest feel lighter. She didn't move closer, didn't speak. She just watched, trying to understand why this human, who had no reason to do so, had chosen to sit beside her. Days passed. Each day, Ethan continued the same routine. He arrived at the cafeteria, tray in hand, and sat beside Leora. He didn't speak unless it was necessary. Sometimes he carried a small gadget to repair, sometimes a data pad, and he would quietly work while she ate. Slowly, she began to notice details she had ignored before. The way he arranged his food neatly, the way he folded his utensils carefully, the way he noticed spills or crumbs on the table and wiped them away without being asked. She began to feel less alone. She wasn't sure why this worked. Perhaps it was the human's quiet confidence, or perhaps it was the simple fact that he respected her space. She didn't have to explain herself, didn't have to justify her silence. He didn't mind, and for the first time in a long while, she felt accepted. One day, the cafeteria was noisier than usual. A group of young aliens laughed loudly, knocking over a chair in their excitement. Leora flinched, wishing she could disappear into the corner. Ethan noticed and shifted slightly closer, not to touch her, but to provide a subtle sense of safety. She glanced at him, and his eyes met hers for a brief moment. No words were exchanged, but she felt the message clearly. You are safe here. Encouraged by this unspoken support, Leora began to participate in small ways. She would adjust a tray for another alien if it wobbled, offer a quiet nod to someone passing by, or even smile faintly at a child who stared curiously at her glowing patterns. These small actions were monumental for her, a step toward reconnecting with a world that had felt overwhelmingly distant. Outside of meals, Ethan and Leora began to notice each other's routines. He would repair minor malfunctions on the station quietly, and she found herself observing his methods with fascination. He worked with precision, understanding the complex systems without unnecessary chatter. Leora had always loved technology, and watching him work sparked a new curiosity. She began to analyze her own skills, thinking about how she might contribute more to the station beyond just quietly existing. One evening, the station experienced a minor power fluctuation. Alarms blared softly in the corridors, and technicians rushed to stabilize the grid. Leora hesitated, unsure if she should act. Ethan appeared beside her, calm and composed. He didn't give orders. He simply moved toward the control panel, motioning with his eyes for her to join. She followed, unsure but trusting him. Together, they worked in silence. Leora adjusted sensors, recalibrated circuits, and predicted the next weak point in the power flow. Ethan worked with steady hands, guiding the machinery through each adjustment. When the alarms finally ceased and the lights returned to normal, no one had noticed their quiet teamwork. But for Leora, it was a revelation. She had been capable all along. She had just never been trusted to act, and here was someone who believed in her enough to include her without a word. After the incident, as the cafeteria cleared late in the evening, Leora sat down at her usual corner table. Ethan joined her, as he always did. This time, she spoke. "Thank you," she said softly. Ethan looked at her and nodded, offering his faint smile. "No need to thank me," he said simply. "Sometimes being there is enough." That sentence stayed with her. She realized that connection didn't always require grand gestures or speeches. Sometimes it was the quiet consistency of someone's presence that made all the difference. Over the next few weeks, Leora's confidence grew. She began volunteering for minor maintenance tasks on the station, helping other aliens in small, unnoticed ways. She discovered that people appreciated her contributions, even if they didn't always understand her. And through it all, Ethan remained beside her, never intrusive, never demanding. His presence was steady, a silent assurance that she was not alone. The station, once an intimidating place of noise and scrutiny, began to feel smaller, warmer, and more manageable. Leora still preferred quiet moments, but she no longer felt isolated. She had found a companion in silence, someone who valued her not for her appearance or her past, but for simply being present. One day, a young alien approached her table, curious about her glowing patterns. Leora smiled faintly, remembering her own fear of interaction. Ethan gave her a small, encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, she offered a soft explanation, pointing out the patterns and their meaning. The young alien listened, fascinated, and asked more questions. Leora answered slowly at first, but with growing confidence. Ethan didn't interrupt, didn't push. He simply sat beside her, sharing the quiet space that had once been hers alone. And for the first time, she realized that she didn't have to be afraid of connection. Trust could be built slowly, word by word, or even in silence. As the evening sun, the artificial light simulating the station's orbital sunset, bathed the cafeteria in soft hues of gold and orange, Leora glanced at Ethan. She felt a surge of gratitude, a sense of peace she had never known. The simple act of someone choosing to sit beside her without a word had transformed her life more than she could have imagined. And so, in that busy, crowded, noisy station, a quiet bond began. It didn't require words, explanations, or ceremonies. It required only presence, patience, and the steady assurance that someone cared enough to simply be there. For Leora, the cafeteria was no longer a place of isolation. It had become a place of calm, connection, and the quiet promise that she did not have to face the galaxy alone. And somewhere deep inside, she began to hope that this small human kindness could be the start of something far greater, something that might finally bridge the space between her and the rest of the world. The morning shift on Station X-17 began as usual, with alarms gently signaling the start of operations and technicians moving through the corridors to check systems. Leora walked beside Ethan as they headed to the engineering bay. For weeks now, she had grown used to his quiet presence, and it had become a comforting routine. She no longer felt the same tension in the corridors, no longer flinched when aliens passed too close. She had learned the subtle rules of the station, and she was starting to find her place within them. As they approached the control hub, a loud alarm suddenly blared. Red lights flashed across the walls, and the hum of the station shifted into a low, anxious vibration. Leora's stomach tightened. Something was wrong. She immediately scanned the display panel in front of her, her glowing patterns flickering slightly in response to her rising pulse. Ethan placed a calm hand on her shoulder. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Leora understood. Together they moved to the main console, where blinking warning signs indicated a critical power surge. The freighter docked nearby. A massive cargo vessel filled with sensitive materials was caught in a magnetic storm. Its docking clamps were failing, and if the surge wasn't stabilized, the freighter could be damaged, along with the station's outer bays. Panic was spreading among other technicians, but Ethan and Leora remained focused. Leora's fingers danced across the control pad, tracing energy flows and scanning the station's conduits. Her mind worked fast, predicting where the next failure might occur. Ethan followed her guidance, adjusting circuits and calibrating the energy dispersal system. They moved together, silently, each trusting the other's instincts. Minutes stretched into long, tense moments. Aliens and humans alike were rushing around, but they seemed to fade into the background. Leora felt a strange clarity in the chaos. She wasn't scared. She was focused. Her skills, which had often gone unnoticed, were now vital. Ethan's quiet confidence bolstered her, giving her the courage to act quickly and decisively. "Leora," Ethan finally said, his voice calm but firm, "divert the secondary flow to the aft conduits. I'll stabilize the primary. We have less than 90 seconds. Leora nodded, her eyes scanning the complex diagram before her. She rerouted the energy, her fingers flying across controls with precision. Sparks flared briefly from a malfunctioning junction, but Ethan was already there, adjusting it back in place. Together, they created a balance between the freighter's power intake and the station's grid, holding the energy surge at bay. The alarm finally ceased. The lights returned to normal, and the tension in the room lifted almost instantly. A few aliens whispered in astonishment, and some technicians even clapped quietly, though they didn't approach the console. Leora's chest heaved with relief, and she allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. Ethan looked at her, eyes reflecting the faint orange glow of the station's simulated sunrise. "You did well," he said softly. "Better than anyone else could have." Leora blinked at him, surprised. No one had ever said that to her with such genuine appreciation. Not for her skills, not for her efforts, not for who she was. She wanted to say something, but words felt inadequate. She simply nodded, letting her gratitude show in her eyes. After the emergency was over, Leora noticed the subtle change in the station's atmosphere. Technicians who had once avoided her now glanced in her direction, a hint of respect in their expressions. Aliens who had whispered about her behind her back seemed more willing to ask for her help, though carefully and politely. She realized that her actions had spoken louder than words, and that quiet competence could earn recognition in ways that gossip and fear never could. Ethan stayed beside her, as always, quietly observing her reactions. He didn't demand attention or praise. His focus was on the task, but his steady presence reminded Leora that she wasn't alone. She felt a warmth she hadn't experienced in a long time, a sense of connection that wasn't forced or awkward, but natural and easy. Days turned into weeks, and Leora's confidence grew. She volunteered for more complex maintenance tasks, assisting Ethan and other engineers on projects that required delicate coordination. She discovered that she had a unique ability to anticipate system failures before they happened, a skill that made her indispensable during high-pressure situations. Her glowing patterns often shifted in response to stress or focus, and Ethan learned to read them as subtle signals of where attention was needed. One evening, as the station rotated to align with its energy receivers, Leora and Ethan were inspecting the outer hull. The vacuum of space stretched beyond the reinforced windows, stars glittering in the infinite black. Leora marveled at the view, but her attention remained on the engineering task at hand. Panels needed recalibration, sensors realigned, and energy conduits adjusted to optimize the station's efficiency. Ethan worked calmly beside her, adjusting a flux regulator with precise movements. Leora noticed how human hands were so different from her own, yet so capable. She realized that humans had a way of solving problems that was both creative and disciplined, and she admired it deeply. "Thank you," Leora said quietly, breaking the silence that had been comforting for so long. Ethan glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "For what?" he asked, though he already knew. "For trusting me," she said, "for letting me be part of this, without forcing me to prove anything." He nodded, understanding her perfectly. "Sometimes the best way to help someone is to give them space to grow," he said softly. "You've done more than you realize." Leora's glowing patterns brightened faintly, a reflection of her emotions. She felt proud, not just of her work, but of the bond she had formed with Ethan. His presence had taught her patience, courage, and the value of quiet companionship. She realized that sometimes words were unnecessary. Actions, trust, and consistent presence spoke louder than any speech or declaration ever could. A few days later, a new challenge arrived. A freighter carrying fragile biological samples had been damaged during its journey, and its containment units were failing. The station's sensors indicated that if the units weren't stabilized, the samples could be lost permanently. The situation required precise calculations and careful coordination. Leora and Ethan were called to lead the stabilization effort. Other engineers looked to them for guidance, but they moved calmly and efficiently, communicating through gestures and shared focus rather than frantic orders. Leora guided the rerouting of power flows, predicting which circuits would overload next. Ethan adjusted the stabilizers, his hands steady and sure. Together, they prevented a disaster that could have cost the station dearly. Afterward, Leora noticed how differently the other engineers now treated her. They no longer avoided her or whispered behind her back. They asked for her advice, sought her input, and even joked lightly in her presence. She realized that respect was earned not through boasting, but through quiet competence and integrity. Ethan continued to sit with her during meals, a constant presence. She no longer felt the anxiety that had once gripped her in the cafeteria. Now, when other aliens glanced curiously or hesitated near her table, she simply smiled faintly, confident in her own place in the world. The simple act of someone sitting beside her, without a word, had transformed not only her days, but her understanding of connection and trust. One evening, as the station's artificial night began, Leora and Ethan stood by the observation window. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the reinforced glass, and the station's hum was the only sound. Leora felt a deep sense of peace. She had found a companion who valued her presence, who respected her space, and who had shown her the power of quiet kindness. "I used to feel invisible," Leora admitted softly, her glowing patterns reflecting the soft light of the observation room. "I thought no one wanted to be near me." Ethan turned to her, his expression calm and warm. "Sometimes it just takes one person to notice," he said. "One person to sit beside you. That's all it takes to start making a difference." Leora smiled, a true smile this time, feeling the weight of months of isolation lift from her shoulders. She realized that humans, with their simple, quiet acts of care, could teach lessons about patience, trust, and connection that no words alone could convey. She had learned that it wasn't about changing herself to fit others. It was about finding someone who would accept her as she was. From that day forward, the cafeteria was no longer a place of loneliness. Leora and Ethan sat together, often in silence, sometimes sharing small conversations, sometimes simply watching the world go by. Other aliens began to join them occasionally, curious and cautious, but Leora welcomed them without fear. She had discovered that the galaxy, vast and intimidating as it was, could feel warm and safe when someone chose to be present without expectation. And so, life on Station X-17 continued, quieter in some ways, but brighter in others. Leora had found not only her confidence but also a companion who showed her the power of patience, understanding, and quiet kindness. She understood now that heroism was not always loud or grand. It could be as simple as sitting beside someone, silently, and letting them know that they were not alone. The station hummed softly around them, but within that quiet hum, Leora felt a deep, steady connection. She had learned that even in the vast emptiness of space, bonds could form, trust could grow, and hearts could open, sometimes with nothing more than a silent, steady presence beside her.